It was just days after the destruction of Earth and her many colonies and outposts. The cataclysm, as it became known, had nearly extinguished humanity's spark from the universe. Billions and billions died, but some survived, less than 1 million souls, grieving the loss of their friends, their families, their homes, their species, and Earth. Billions of years of the evolution of life were destroyed in hours. 99% of Earth's flora and fauna were gone forever. Even those seated on the colony worlds were exterminated. So the call went out, and the last vestiges of humanity gathered on one of the few worlds to escape destruction. Only escaping destruction because it was in the last stages of terraforming. Expeditions were sent to retrieve pieces of Earth and the other destroyed colonies. A memorial for the dead and a promise of revenge. The survivors came and held ceremonies for all they lost, and then they swore revenge. They swore to track down the enemy and teach them their mistake, the mistake of not completely exterminating humanity. They left some alive and filled them with a terrible thirst for revenge, one that could only be sated by the extermination of the enemy. The enemy left more than 150,000 wrecks after their defeat. It took years to gather it all, examine it, and disassemble ships for study. Never before had humans been so focused on a task. They salvaged everything from the battlefield, Terran and alien. All but a few of mankind's remaining outposts were dismantled. The broken remnants of both fleets were scrapped and used in the construction of the 5 massive motherships and in rebuilding the human navy. It was a tremendous undertaking to construct the biggest starships in this galaxy. Examining, deciphering, and reverse engineering the enemy's tech had advanced humanity's technical knowledge by leaps and bounds. Examining the enemy bodies revealed them to be genetically engineered clones. They averaged 2 meters in height and 135 kilograms in weight with 4 arms, 2 of which ended in hands of 4 fingers and 2 thumbs. The other ended in a nasty set of claws. Their 4 eyes were set above a muzzle that held an impressive number of sharp fangs. Auditory openings were located on the neck, and the olfactory were under the jaw. Their cranium was thick, with a small crest down the middle. They were bipedal with legs that bent backward like a horse. Their feet ended in 6 toes, with talons that were curved in such a way as to rip the target's flesh off when kicked. Their body was covered in multiple plates of a black, chitinous form of armor. The navigational data gave them descriptions of tens of thousands of stars and millions of planets, moons, and other astral phenomenon. It allowed them to locate the wormhole that connected the Milky Way to the Andromeda Galaxy. It showed the locations of several more. But the most coveted information had not been found yet, the location of the enemy's home or their name. So the humans just called them the Wraith. The name was taken from a fictional evil alien race in a 21st century TV show. The information gleaned from their ships and equipment allowed the humans to completely revamp their starship design. New pilot neural interfaces allowed smaller crews per ship. The reduction in crew space left more room for armor, weapons, or sensors. Humanity's centuries of fascination with the sci-fi genre was invaluable. It inspired new ideas to explore the limits of what they knew. The limited numbers of humans meant not only did quality need to outweigh quantity, but everything created needed to maximize the potential of individual humans. Books, short stories, games, movies, TV shows, and even animation inspired new ideas. Not all were useful. Transporters were not possible with current tech, but power armor, mechs, weapons, and 100's other ideas. Destroyers now needed just a single pilot, cruisers 3, and capital ships 24. Only the carriers had a large crew, but where it had needed thousands, it took hundreds. The combining of human and Wraith technology allowed for ships faster, tougher, and far more deadly than what the Wraith encountered in the Milky Way. For 10 long years, humans worked tirelessly mining materials for their great ships. Food was grown and preserved in millions of tons, until finally they were ready. The Revenge, the Vengeance, the Reckoning, the Retribution, and the Avenger were fit for launch 10 kilometers long, 6 kilometers wide, and 3 kilometers tall. Each ship could hold 10 times the number of humans still alive. From a race that numbered in the tens of billions to now just over 1 million men, women, and children. Giant facilities turned out the weapons humanity needed, from small arms to mechs to warships. Docking ports allowed the capital ships to ride the mother ships, like remoras to a massive shark. Massive hangars held fighters, destroyers, and cruisers. In a matter of moments, a fleet of 5 could become a fleet of 5,000. Thousands of weapon systems dotted the hulls, from standard railguns and missile batteries to massive plasma cannons that could devastate a planet, and everything in between. It was then that humanity left the galaxy of their birth and began the Great Hunt. From this moment on, there were only 2 options left: victory or death. Aboard his flagship, Revenge, Admiral Tanaka stood over the tech's shoulder as the fleet entered a new system. It was his ritual to look and to think, let this be the one. For 30 long years, the humans prowled the stars in search of their prey, and for 30 long years they'd only found signs of their activities, but not them. Dead worlds, planets split into hundreds of floating rocks, or the remains of extinct civilizations. They'd stop and explore the last, looking for signs of their foe. 6 months here, a year there, gathering resources needed for the journey, never forgetting their oath given to their dead. Humanity had thrived during the journey. There were over 5 million of them now. One of the technologies they discovered and improved upon was cold sleep. This let humanity conserve resources during the trip and keep their forces at prime readiness. Only 1/4 were out of cold sleep for a year. Pregnant women and children under 15 were excluded. The Admiral turned to look at asked, "Captain Isle, status of the fleet?" Captain Isle double-checked his console before replying, "All present and accounted for." "Thank you, Captain. Deploy recon units and assume defensive formation," the Admiral acknowledged. The bridge crew worked with the efficiency their search had provided. Basic data rolled in immediately: number of planets and moons, other celestial bodies present, and distances from the flagship's current position. So when an excited voice called for the Admiral's attention, everyone focused on her. "Admiral, Recon 7 reports enemy contact at the 4th moon of the 5th planet." Admiral Tanaka externally kept up a calm demeanor, but inside he was shouting with joy. "Finally, you bastards! Focus, Ensign, and remember your training," the Admiral reminded her. "I need more info." The Ensign looked abashed, but continued to relay incoming info. "Yes, sir, sorry, sir," her voice steadied. "Recon 7 states an enemy fleet of approximately 120 ships. They are continuing to gather intel on types and more exact numbers. Long-range sensors also detect a large debris field in the area of the fleet." "Recon 7 says there appears to be weapons fire directed at the planet," she finished. The Admiral gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze to let her know how well she'd done. "Thank you, Ensign." When the Admiral turned to face Captain Isle, the look they gave each other conveyed their agreement. "Captain, inform the fleet of the situation. Do you concur we have sufficient force currently available to engage the enemy?" "Yes, Admiral." Before continuing, "As long as there aren't any more in the system or reinforcements, join them." Admiral Tanaka thought for a moment before answering. "Begin revival procedures. Non-combatants transferred to the Avenger and Retribution." He then turned to one of the communication techs. "Switch to the fleet-wide channel, if you please." This channel allowed the Admiral to directly address every ship in the fleet and over the mothership's internal comm systems. When the tech gave a nod, the Admiral spoke into the handset. "Attention the fleet, we've found an enemy force and our revenge starts today. We've spent decades working to this moment and we are ready." Admiral Tanaka had waited decades to say this. "Battle stations, let's fuck 'em up." Captain Isle looked at the Admiral with a raised eyebrow, to which the Admiral responded with a boyish grin and a laugh. "What? I couldn't think of anything else." The bridge crew laughed before turning to their stations and starting the process of bringing the fleet to full combat readiness. Returning to seriousness, he spoke to the bridge crew. "I want all the Avenger and Retribution and their ships to hang back in reserve. The Vengeance and Reckoning to join us in engaging the enemy fleet." Admiral Tanaka continued. "I want all ships crewed and ready for the launch the second we land behind the enemy." Klaxons sounded throughout the massive ships, joined by the sounds of boots pounding on metal as crews ran to their stations. Shuttles ferried the non-combatants to the Avenger and Retribution, while the process of awakening the personnel in cryosleep began. It seemed like forever, but in less than 15 minutes, the fleet was ready for combat. Captain Isle confirmed this. "Admiral, fleet signals readiness. Non-combatants have been transferred, all ships and guns are manned, and defensive measures are at maximum efficiency." "Very good, Captain. Let it begin." Captain Isle turned and gave the long-awaited order. "Signal the fleet to jump." The quick burst of FTL put them in range of the enemy between one heartbeat and the next. The Admiral glanced at the tactical officer, who replied with a nod that all 3 ships had hit the mark. "Launch all ships. Revenge, Vengeance, and Reckoning are to engage their capital ships, dreadnoughts, and carriers to assist. All other ships engage the sub-capital ships." The Admiral gave a predatory grin before giving the long-awaited order. "All batteries open fire." Untold numbers of Wraith died before they even knew what happened. The sheer power of the opening volley turned dozens of ships into floating wrecks, while others ceased to exist entirely. Decades of righteous fury were unleashed upon humanity's most hated foe. What happened next wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. While humanity's tech level had advanced at a rapid pace, the enemy's had not. Terran weapons tore through armor and shields with minimal trouble, but Wraith return fire caused limited damage. It took less than 10 minutes to completely obliterate every Wraith vessel. The bridge crew gave a huge cheer before a tech interrupted. "Admiral, weapons fire detected on the moon's surface. Wraith have landed troops and are engaging the locals." Admiral Tanaka gave back a nod. "Thank you. Relay all relevant intel to General Garcia." The Admiral contacted the General. "Did you catch all that, General?" General Garcia replied, "Yes, Admiral, intel coming in now." "Excellent, you may drop when ready," said the Admiral before following up with, "Good luck, Juan, kick their ass and take no prisoners." The General had a huge grin as he answered, "With pleasure." It took only moments for the landing ships to launch and streak towards the surface. "Communications! Broadcast on all frequencies, we are here to assist against the enemy." And then the Admiral looked at another officer. "Check our database for any info on the locals, especially language." General Garcia and his troopers had a rough ride to the surface, but they wouldn't have missed it for the world. At 2 kilometers, designated ships began to launch 150 drop troops in power armor. They had limited flight capabilities, enough to get them down safely and maneuver easier on the ground. Firing on the way down, they hit the LZ and began securing it for the landing ships. Alerted by the loss of their fleet, the Wraith sent a force to engage the unknown attackers. They didn't send enough. 1,000 Wraith walked into a buzzsaw. They went down before they could even contact their commanders. A few humans walked among the carnage and administered the coup de grace to those still breathing. While that was being done, the landing ships disgorged massive mechs, armor, and ground pounders in augmented body armor. Scouts were sent out in a 360-degree circle to examine the enemy forces. General Garcia checked his watch. Ready reaction force on the ground and ready for action in 20 minutes. Not bad. The General keyed his chin mic. "All units, I want weapons and armor checks done. You got 10 minutes. He looked over at his mechs and armored vehicles. "When checks are finished, mount up and prepare to move out." 10,000 human fighters prepared to start their campaign of revenge. His scouts began feeding him intel of destroyed villages, dead civilians, and soldiers, with only a few dead Wraith. The locals were heavily outmatched by the enemy. Then the scouts were sent towards the large settlement they'd seen as they landed and reported a large enemy force was engaged with the locals. And the locals were about to be overrun. He beckoned over a nearby officer before speaking. "Toby, load up your troops and drop between the enemy and the locals. Buy us some time to engage their rear." Captain Asim saluted and ordered his power armor to load onto their dropships and be ready to drop. Group leader Hamalak peered over the lip of the trench, watching the Pachial advancing on his position. They didn't know their name, so his people just called them Doom from above. Hopelessness was beginning to overwhelm the last of his surviving troops, but they could not run and leave all the civilians to the tender mercy of the enemy. So they stood their ground, exchanging fire in a futile attempt to keep them from the settlement behind them. Every moment they held the enemy back, Bought with blood and death was another for civilians to reach the vast warren of underground tunnels and bunkers. One of his soldiers exclaimed, "Group leader!" before pointing to the sky. Hamilak looked at the spacecraft flying in his direction. His shoulders slumped as he saw his impending doom flying in his direction. So imagine his surprise when the ships turned and flew parallel to his trench line. They shot fire into the mass of Pachial, while some sort of bipedal being dropped from the ship and landed on thrusters of fire. He saw it was some sort of armor, but of a type he'd never heard of, black with 4 appendages, 2 legs and 2 arms. It had some sort of rifle in its hands and that pack that let it drop safely to the ground. The helmet completely covered what he assumed was the head. The mysterious aliens turned and engaged the enemy. One of them turned towards him and pointed to itself, and then its weapon, and then the enemy. It then pointed at him and then to the settlement. It took a moment for Hamilak to understand, but then figured it out. He spoke into his communicator. "All units, fall back to the village and regroup. The alien units will cover our retreat." Hamilak and his soldiers grabbed their wounded, climbed out of the trench, and ran for the village as fast as their 4 legs could go. They took cover in the buildings that gave the best protection without sacrificing their line of fire. General Garcia watched the feed from the helmet cams of several of his troops in power armor. He estimated at least 40,000 Wraith, arrayed in formations of around 10K each. Only one formation was attacking the settlement, and was now being engaged by his troopers. Snipers and scouts effectively eliminated all of the Wraith sentries they could locate. It was a complete surprise when they attacked the rear of the enemy formation. Railguns, autocannons, missiles, plasma, and metal projectiles in the thousands tore into the unprepared ranks of the hated foe. Mechs and some armored units remained to hold the rear, while his infantry and the rest of the armored units began to flank the Wraith on both sides. As reports came back, General Garcia thought to himself, "Got my own canny in the making, maybe I'll have them call me Hannibal from now on." Just like in space, the Wraith were unprepared for the new human technology. The human losses were minimal, and most of those were just wounded. Once he got word both sides had met up with the power armor units, he gave the order, "Advance and no mercy." From his new position, Group Leader Hamilak watched as the new aliens charged into the horde of Pachial. They fought with a fury unlike anything he'd ever seen. The armored soldiers weren't content to just shoot at the enemy, but they charged into the middle of them, firing their weapons, slashing with some sort of blades that extended from the forearms, or just punching, kicking, and stomping on the Pachial. And before long, none of the Pachial were still standing. Some aliens were walking through the carnage and finishing the surviving Pachial. A pair of aliens walked up to Hamilak, and by how others responded, it must be the leader. The pair removed their helmets and looked at Hamilak before saying something in their language. He couldn't understand their words, but studied them curiously. They had 2 eyes, 2 ears, a mouth, what he guessed was a nose, and a small bit of fur on the top of their head. Their flesh was 2 different colors. He was inspecting their armor when his superiors arrived and gladly let them take over this first contact. The first shots of humanity's war of retribution had been fired. The first victory was won, and the first new allies were found. Many more of both would happen before the resolution of the humans' promises to their dead were honored. But those tales are for another time.